Before we go deep diving into the upcoming projects, I thought it would be fun to take a look at a more recent and smaller release that I've been burning a few hours on as it develops, and that's Towerful Defense. And while it may not be a super obvious game with a name like that, this is a tower defense game, I know. Hard to believe. Now, sarcasm aside, this does fall into the realm of a more modern-style roguelite tower defense title, with stage progression, upgrades, etc. And since it's more straightforward to implement with these features, it even follows the odd trend over the past few years of being a centralized tower with tools rather than building up pathing like more traditional tower defense titles from previous decades. So in terms of how this plays, expect something more in line with Heretic's Fork rather than more path-focused stuff like Axon TD or Rogue Tower. This centralized tower system also lends itself well to offering the player options when it comes to level of engagement, and Towerful Defense takes a fairly standard approach to this, with the tower itself automatically firing bullets at the closest target, like most other titles in the mono tower subgenre, and then pairing it with player-activated skills. Though don't worry if you're wanting it to shift to be a little bit more auto-battler in style, you can set up auto-triggering for the skills as well, and for some of them this is better, while others you will be better off if you manually aim them just due to how they trigger. Some standout examples that I used quite a bit would be setting the freeze ability to auto-target the fastest enemy, since my reflexes are not quite good enough to catch the speeding meteors, but setting the time bombs and even sometimes the landmines to manual targeting, so I could set up perimeters or properly aim them at enemies I wanted to take down. Now that said, the skill pool is fairly limited, with 7 of them being selectable at the start, and a handful beyond that only being able to be obtained mid-run. You are going to get a feel for which ones you want to use after only a couple runs, with a few even being pretty specific to a type of run focus, or even just some cases a tower focus. Now, you may notice in some of the gameplay throughout this, I'm abusing the cold skill, but in my runs since the 1.0 version, Cold Tower seems to be less reliable for me, even though it is still amazingly good. I just have not been able to get RNG to deliver me that sweet increased radius that let me basically permafreeze everything. But not sure if that's just, as I mentioned, RNG, or if it's actually a balance change. And this does bring up an important point though. As a roguelite, it is going to be RNG based. This just comes with the territory of choosing power-ups between levels and having an ever-expanding toolset that unlocks as you go to higher difficulties and challenges. This is also sadly one of the things that causes problems for me in a lot of roguelites, since I very frequently hit a wall of unlocking too much, and generally being unable to play with some of the fun combos, since you just start needing luck for them to show up. Towerful Defense absolutely shares this problem, and there are runs I've lost purely to bad RNG refusing to give me combos. But you can mitigate it a bit by focusing on specific stats, such as an actual luck stat, that pushes it toward giving you more specific rarities of upgrades. There's even a bit of a deck thinning that can be done, but those are a bit less reliable than I would like, since they either randomly select a card, or give you a choice of one of 3 cards that are just pulled from dozens. This randomness means that you will see fun combos and really not want to go for them, unfortunately. I've done dozens if not more runs trying for but never once being able to pull off the negative range combo, and I've only been able to pull off a heavy skill tower a couple times, since both of these setups rely heavily on getting one specific card to set them off. Having this feature in a number of games in this subgenre makes me really hope the next evolution will start to include a proper deck building mechanic to help mitigate this a bit, or make it more player controllable, especially since they almost all use the card motif as their method of showing off the randomized improvements you get, rather than chests, rooms, critters, etc. that you find in roguelites of other genres. But that is a discussion for another video. Turning back to Towerful Defense, there's still a lot of fun things to play with, both RNG and non-RNG. And there is mitigation to the RNG in the form of rerolls, with there even being cards that benefit you for using those rerolls in the shops. So it's not as bad as, say, Rogue Tower when it comes to just hoping you find what you want, but you do still need luck. The towers you can choose from can also somewhat influence how you play, though I do wish they would have actually turned that to 11 instead. It's mostly minor differences, with the Tulb being the only base tower that really feels like it has its own character, since the other ones are basically just the money tower, the XP tower, and the health tower. The Tulb, however, is the shooter tower, with increased attack speed, a penalty to skills, making it really lean the player into a specific mindset. The unlockable towers do seem a little different from the base towers, with Blinder rewarding you for knowing cards and stats since it hides them from you, and each of the rest providing slightly different challenge modes to play in basically, with an odd focus of a few of them on tower health play. If I were to design some towers to add though, I would totally recommend, say, a skill tower mirror to the Tulb for more of a wizard vibe, and would absolutely recommend towers that focus on stuff like melee or even specific damage types, since these are in there in terms of abilities, but never really feel like you've been incentivized to focus on them unless you get shoehorned into them by early draws. Now, the first skill selection on the flip side absolutely does this a bit better, though you might not realize it until after you've played a few rounds. For example, if you choose the Airblade, a weapon that spins around your tower, by default can kill up to 10 enemies per swing, you'll be pushed towards using tower melee damage to ramp its power up. But if you choose Landmine, you'll want to pump your bullet damage and tower range to make them really punch above their weight. This first skill selection is also almost a core part of the tower too, since it gets a massive cooldown boost compared to the other skills you get, meaning it will be your spam ability usually, and your way of getting supplies on everything other than the Tulb, since the other towers cannot target supplies with their bullets. Later skills you get can be used just like this, and the starter skills are available throughout a run too, but without the cooldown bonus. Generally speaking, these are going to be much more support-oriented unless you get specific cards to help them. Now, the final aspect of the design, and the one I think they put the most effort into, is the roguelite system itself. There are a ton of fun combos there. You can go infinite bullet spam, you can go with a barrier that damages enemies when they enter your range, you can go with freezes, shocks, ricochets, piercing effects, you name it. There's probably an odd way to apply it. Though, oddly, there is no burn that I'm aware of, which is a missed opportunity, but there is a plague effect. That said, the plague is not entirely what you'd expect, since it's not only increasing the damage you deal to the enemy, but it increases their speed and damage as well, basically turning every infected enemy into a glass cannon, and it spreads, for better or worse, which is an interesting risk versus reward proposal for any tower defense, and one I have not seen used too often, but would like to see used more. Now, the enemy design is good enough for the game, with the first things you encounter being the fairly bog-standard enemies that just march towards the tower trying to hit it. Then their immediate upgrades being either larger or getting guns and start shooting when they get into range, though as you progress, you'll see interference enemies that don't actually damage the tower, but will block your shots. You'll see meteors that dash in and explode at high speed, and then you get into the higher difficulties and you'll see more complex enemies. Things like multi-part enemies, medics, speeders, etc. don't ever really become the standard enemy, but they do show up and will put a wrench into a number of cheese strategies that you may have worked on lower hostility levels, but will not work on higher ones. The medics specifically shut down some of the shove and freeze strategies I used, since they're one of the few enemies that can fully activate outside of your tower's core range and heal all nearby enemies. Now, the one thing that I would say actually makes me a little irked, and this is a conscious decision made for the game itself, because it's on the Steam page as a perk, would be the talent point system. As a meta progression system, this type of deal is fine, but I personally would have rather had them as just a grindable resource rather than strictly as a limited acquisition type deal, especially with the escalating point cost per perk. Instead, they just kind of feel a bit tacked on because you're so limited in how far you can take them. And for me, roguelites are all about eventually getting those ridiculous broken builds that can even push top-end gaming rigs to their limits, like we see in games like Noida, Binding of Isaac, etc. You will never really reach that point in this game, even in endless mode, though you can get close. Overall though, I think it's a pretty fun base game, and while I would have loved for them to push some of the features a bit further, I think the core game is a solid one, especially for a game in one of the more chill genres. So if you're looking for a tower defense with roguelite elements for your tower's growth and possibly even a bit of auto-battling mechanics, this is worth looking at. It may not be something you seek 10,000 hours into, but it is definitely a fun pick up and play for your downtime.